Hello and welcome. My name is Marjorie Esteville, and I will be the host and moderator for this ADEIL conference session. Thank you for joining us for Remote Language Instruction. Yeah, well, please welcome Sarah Corpy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time today. For some of you, I'm sure it's quite early today to attend this session on remote language instruction. If you aren't involved in remote language instruction, you are absolutely in the right place. While my content area is languages, most of what I will be talking about today is transferable to other subject areas as well. There are handouts for this session and copies of the slides in the Google Drive, and the link for these handouts is in the chat. I thought I would start today by sharing a bit of my background with you. For those who read my title carefully, you won't be surprised that my language of instruction is German. German is considered a Category 2 language for American English speakers, so that means it's a bit more difficult than Spanish or French for native English speakers to learn, but not as challenging as Russian, Turkish, or Hebrew. I've spent 18 years teaching German in the classroom, and for 13 of those years, I also taught German in an asynchronous distance education program. I have directed that distance education program for 6 years and also spent 2 years working as the assistant director of a private tutoring center where I arranged personalized curricular plans and taught students ranging in age from pre-K to college. At the tutoring center, my main subjects of instruction were phonics, reading, math, and study skills. The asynchronous distance education program I taught in and direct is known as an independent study program. This program has a rich history dating back to 1892 and has seen several different types of delivery methods over the years. It began as strictly print correspondence, and added radio, TV, cassette tape, CD, and email over the years. One of the major shifts over the past 6 years was a shift in methods from print correspondence, which supposes a larger lag time between instructor-student communication and a static delivery method, to an internet-based approach, which supposes faster turnaround time and dynamic delivery methods. Some of the first courses in this program were language courses, including Arabic. The basic structure of the courses included a textbook, study notes, and assignments, and it was vital for the assessments to be in alignment with the textbook and study notes because there was not the opportunity for instructor-student engagement between assignments. The study notes took the place of traditional lectures and offered students a different explanation and other examples than what was available in the textbook. There was an understanding that different explanations or approaches work better for some students, and so an effort was made to ensure that students had at least 2 different approaches available to them. Rather than high-stakes assessments, the assignments functioned as a discussion between a student and their instructor. If the goals of the assignment were not met, the assignment feedback functioned as further instruction, and students often had the opportunity to rework their assignment for additional feedback and credit. What I hope you heard in that description is that universal design was used in the courses to remove barriers for students, that assessments were in alignment with learning outcomes and course content, and that iterative feedback was used to ensure that each student was able to show their learning. This spring semester, I was teaching an intermediate pronunciation and conversation course with in-person class sessions. As you might imagine, the course relied heavily on students speaking in class. At the start of spring break, I was told that all instruction would be remote for the remainder of the semester. This transition is a challenge I know many of my colleagues also faced, and one that was particularly difficult for courses with a lab component or courses that relied on spontaneous discussion and conversation in class. I found myself using several strategies in my course that I had developed through my experience teaching in the distance education program. So let's pause and make sure we all have a common understanding of universal design. Universal design is the first thing that came to mind when I was thinking about transitioning to remote instruction. I knew from experience that not all students were going to be able to participate in live class sessions for a variety of reasons. The internet could have an outage, or broadband might be too low in rural areas. Some students might be living at home with disturbances from siblings and parents. Others might not have a quiet space to work during class time. And in the face of a global pandemic, such great uncertainty and such massive change, I anticipated that some of my students might experience mental health challenges that prevented them from attending class remotely. For all these reasons, I elected to offer students multiple ways to engage with the course content and demonstrate their learning. To ensure that class preparation was done, I created discussion assignments where students worked in groups to answer content questions or discuss a topic. To ensure that all students received the benefit from any discussion that occurred in class, I divided students into remote delivery teams. If someone was missing from class, they could reach out to their team for a recap. To ensure that students were able to access additional pronunciation content covered in class, I created a series of brief videos that they could watch. And all assessments were available online with flexible access and due dates. For the final project, I gave students a goal and left it up to them how they met that goal. Links to authentic texts and target language videos were available in Canvas. Canvas is our learning management system. And these were organized into weekly modules. Students could access this content whenever it was convenient for them. For the live class sessions, we used Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. These sessions looked quite similar to what I would have done in the classroom, but I distilled the content and activities to the most essential parts. This was especially important because in the remote learning environment, things take longer to set up and carry out than they do in the classroom. The recorded content, a video duplicate of pronunciation activities from class, was recorded in advance and available to all students in the weekly modules. I relied heavily on student remote instruction teams, office hours, and email correspondence to help clarify confusing points. With universal design and curricular delivery, I could lean heavily on my experience in the distance education program. Not so with classroom management. When students are located throughout the US in different time zones with different internet access and different working environments, I assumed that there would be times when a
Looks
student
like
would...
we have a freeze here.
Okay.
Sarah might.
Sarah, I
Marjorie,
think
you...
you're good to go.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So let's see. So I was talking about classroom management. So when students are located throughout the US in different time zones with different internet access and different working environments, I assumed that there would be times when a student wouldn't be able to engage in our live class sessions. And for this reason, I ensured that alternative options were built into the course. I pre-recorded the critical content and provided all preparatory materials well in advance. Discussions were set up so students could demonstrate their engagement in the content of the day, even if they weren't able to join the live session. One of the most important pieces of classroom management is expectation setting. Of course, we had already done this in the live class, but with the switch to remote delivery, I felt it important to reset classroom norms and agreements of how we wanted to be together in the new space. Some of these agreements were not negotiable. Those are the agreements that are in bold in the digital handout. And on the next slide, I'll have a copy of those agreements as well. I invited students to contribute their own ideas, and if one of my non-negotiables was missed, I suggested it during the brainstorming session. And it's important to note, I think here, since it is a language class, when we are setting norms of behavior, I do use English for that. I am a believer in using the target language in class whenever possible. And also, there are times when using English is more efficient and effective and in line with the goals. So it's really important to me to think about the goals of the activity. So the goals of setting classroom norms in a classroom agreement is that everyone understands how we're going to be together in the classroom. So it's not as important to me that everyone can communicate about that in German. And so because the focus is really on um, the creation of those norms and collaborating and making sure that those norms are understood, I do use English for the norm creation activity in beginning and intermediate levels. Once we get to advanced levels, then students should have the linguistic ability to carry out those activities in German. In terms of small group agreements, there are a lot of approaches that can be used for student breakout group agreements. Students could fill out a Google form that's shared with screen sharing. Students can use the chat, they can type on the whiteboard, they can discuss in small groups and report out, among other things. And I'll talk a little bit later about breakout groups again, but I did want to mention at this point that I found dedicated and random breakout groups to be an excellent way to increase student engagement throughout the entire course. One aspect of remote synchronous sessions that was difficult for me to adapt to was the lack of student feedback as I spoke. Most students kept their audio and video off, so it was difficult for me to tell if there were any questions, if people needed me to explain further, if anyone was listening to me at all. I found that my group really did enjoy engaging in polls, and so I would often set up a quick poll to assess the room, decide what transition would work best, and then move on. The tool that I used, Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, didn't allow for more than one poll, so I used either copy paste from another document or did a very quick check-in on the fly where needed. I understand that some other web conferencing tools, including Zoom, allow polls to be loaded in advance, which I find to be an especially useful feature. Two other features that I used in remote classroom management were the chat and the raise your hand feature. Raise your hand works pretty much like it does in the live classroom, but I also used it for informal polls. So raise your hand if you want another example. Some students also really enjoy engaging through the chat, and so I had to learn to keep my eye on the chat throughout class so I was not missing anything. And in future terms, because I'm not personally very good at multitasking with instruction and chat monitoring at the same time, I do plan to designate a different student each day as the chat watcher, someone to answer basic questions, engage in conversation through the chat as they like, and then also to verbally alert me to issues or questions that come up through the chat, just so I don't miss anything.
And speaking of a chat comment, Casey Carroll says a trick with Collaborate is to include your question and numbered answers on a slide and just bring up the blank poll quickly. Just saying.
Yeah, Casey, that is an absolutely fantastic idea that I had not thought of. Thank you so much for sharing that. I do think that would kind of speed things up in terms of polling. So thank you for sharing that. All right, so the classroom agreements document, and I used this little Google Docs icon on the slides when you could be following along in a Google Doc. So just to cue you in on that little blue document in the corner. So these are some examples of agreements that my class came up with. We decided it was important to come prepared to class, to log in 2 to 3 minutes early if possible, to test and troubleshoot your microphone, to find a quiet distraction-free space if possible, to remain muted with your camera off if you're not speaking, to turn your camera on if bandwidth allows when you are speaking, to use the raise your hand function if you wish to speak and wait to be invited, to use I statements and speak from your own experience. We decided that campus student conduct policies do apply, and to be respectful and assume good intent. A lot of these are really conversation and discussion based agreements, the ones that I found to be especially useful. And that is because it was a conversation class. So some of the topics that we were touching on were a bit challenging for some students. And so having those things stated in advance was important. The process that I suggest for creating a classroom agreements document is to brainstorm with the students and create the document together with the students in class. They can really buy into the documents if they have the ability to contribute to it. And then once the document is created, everyone agrees to it, it can be shared, and then revisiting as you need to throughout the semester. Maybe you need to add something, maybe there's something in the agreement that doesn't work. And so it's a living, breathing document, or intended to be. And so that uh, keeping that in mind and revisiting that throughout the semester, I think, is a good practice. All right. A foundation of forming effective student teams is the classroom agreement document. So once this agreement document is complete, I invited individual teams to add to it for their own team interaction. Now this past spring, because I had the benefit of knowing my students already and their linguistic abilities, I created intentional remote instruction teams. So by intentional, I mean I ensured there were at least 2 strong members of each team. I ensured that the teams didn't have just one person of a particular gender. And I also set the teams up so that international students would be paired with another international student. So an international student would not be alone in a student group with only American students. Before the first day of remote instruction, I gave each team a name. Because it was a German class, I named them after German trees. So each team had a German tree as their name. And then I posted the team name and the team rosters in Canvas. And then on the first day of instruction, after we set the classroom agreements, I sent each team into a breakout room to add to the agreements and share with their teammates anything that they wanted about challenges or issues that they anticipated they might have with remote classes. Some examples of challenges might include low broadband, spotty connections, unreliable technology, the lack of a private workspace, the presence of siblings or parents, family responsibilities on a particular day. And so really connecting about their needs. They could also share if they enjoyed taking notes or like to verbally share out in a large group, if they had a stable enough internet at home to be the spokesperson for their group. And as I said, throughout the term, I used a mixture of remote delivery team and random group assignments for discussion board posts and classroom conversations. So students had regular ongoing engagement with their team members, and they also had regular engagement with other students in the class. Anytime students were working together in a group, students were given a Google Doc worksheet to complete in their teams. And I found this to be beneficial because I could watch the edits in the Google Docs as they happened. And so this helped me to identify groups that may be stuck. I could also tell when groups were nearly finished with their tasks and could let people know that they should wrap up. And then I did want to normalize communication between myself and students about how things were going in their student teams, so that if something were to go wrong, they would have a way to tell me about it without doing anything out of the norm. So I did require group rubrics from each student for each group session. And in this rubric, they rated their group performance, their own performance, and could tell me anything they thought I should know. Examples were included to demonstrate what kind of comments I was expecting that students might make in the rubrics. And I did use a Word doc for these rubrics. Moving forward, I would use a Google form so that I could see all the data in one location. And so there would be less work that students needed to invest in completing the rubric. It really is just meant to be a checkpoint. So I am well aware that when groups are not set up correctly, one or a small group of students might take over the group, or one or a small group of students might feel that they have to do more work than the other team members. Since these teams were in place primarily for synchronous and asynchronous discussion and for keeping each other caught up with missed sessions, I found 3 rotating roles to be adequate. My students weren't, these 3 rotating roles are the conversation facilitator, so the person whose job it was in the discussion to keep the team on track and to make sure that all assigned topics were discussed. The second role was the note taker. This person took the notes and filled out the team summary or team worksheet for the day, and that's the document that was in Google Docs. And then the third role was the inclusion officer. And for the inclusion officer, this individual was to pay attention to who was speaking, notice who was not speaking, to invite people in so that all voices would be heard, and during discussion to advocate for the discussion of all options and all opinions. If the group needed to make a decision, the inclusion officer was to advocate for the minority opinion during the discussion so that one student wouldn't be alone in the discussion or alone in the opinion. So my students, turns out, weren't especially thrilled with the inclusion officer idea, but I did think that that role was especially important when students were engaging in discussions and work that I would personally normally monitor in a face-to-face class, but I could not monitor all groups at the same time in the same way through remote instruction. And it was also my intent with the setup of that inclusion officer to give one student the ability to disagree with a majority group decision without personally holding responsibility for that decision. So I wanted someone to be able to raise challenges or find issues with the decision and vocalize them without actually holding those beliefs themselves. And it was my hope that this would make the project as a whole much stronger. So this is, again, in the handouts in the Google Drive, but this is some examples of the group members' behavioral expectations that we set out in the long-term group formation. And you'll notice that, again, the language that I'm using here is English. This is, again, so that students were able to connect about how they were going to work together in German. And so they were able to fully express themselves and their needs and their strengths and make sure that the group came together in a solid way before diverting off into the target language. So once in their breakout groups, establishing group norms without the influence of their instructor, I believe, is important. And especially important when their instructor won't be able to hear their group interactions as they occur. So each team member was asked to bring what they need to this activity and in terms of what they need in terms of how to be productive. So in order to work efficiently and effectively as a team, what do you need in order to be successful? And so each team member brought that need to the activity. And then the group was able to decide how they could help meet that need. And I did find it important during setup of this activity to let students know that they will be finding a balance in the activity. So no voices are silenced, and so students also have realistic expectations. So for example, Buck E. Badger, I'm at Madison, so we're the Badgers. So Buck E. Badger is always my example student. needs punctuality. If another student needs flexibility, then the group has to decide how to balance the need for punctuality and the need for flexibility. And holding space for that discussion, I thought, was very important. So in the next part of the activity, I asked students to read through elements of effective teamwork and their descriptions. These elements and the descriptions are available in the session handouts. And the elements I highlighted were communication, participation, give and take, leadership, organization, preparation, procedure, capability, commitment, and progress and assessment. So one of my goals for the element of effective teamwork was for students to identify for themselves and for their teammates which strengths they were personally bringing to the group. So each member identified at least one, but potentially more than one strength, and tied it to a specific activity, so how that would look in group work. I also wanted students to select a skill that they could develop through the teamwork. I teach German, but one of my goals for students is for them to develop a flexible mindset and to see themselves as people who can grow and change, and not rather than as fixed individuals. So this mindset, I understand from my colleagues at the Madison-based Center for Healthy Minds, supports overall mental health. And so in this activity, I'm also trying to normalize the idea that we are not all good at everything, but that we can work on developing skills that are challenging for us and get better at them. So rather than saying, for example, I will never remember the grammatical gender of these German nouns, and German has 3 different grammatical genders, so it can get frustrating. Instead of just giving up, I want students to say, I will get better at remembering the grammatical gender of these German nouns slowly over time with lots of practice. And so identifying a skill development is one way that I can point students toward things that they can develop in themselves and grow. So I am a believer in backup plans. We had the class backup plan. So as I said, we met in Blackboard Collaborate, and the plan was if Blackboard Collaborate doesn't work, we'll hop over into Microsoft Teams. And so I had a parallel class set up in Microsoft Teams so that students would know if Blackboard Collaborate isn't working and Sarah sends me an email, I will hop into Google Teams or Microsoft Teams. And in the event that Blackboard Collaborate and Microsoft Teams was not working, my students were still responsible for having audio conversations in German with members of their alternate delivery teams. This was especially important because the focus of the course was pronunciation and conversation. And so in order to practice that, I needed my students to be talking in German and having conversations with each other in German. And they did need to be verbal conversations. So the alternative delivery teams did set up communication plans. So if they weren't able to connect with me during a specific day, there were still conversation topics that they would complete in their alternative delivery teams in a different format. So in support of this goal, I asked each student to share with their group members what technology was available to them. So I was trying to avoid students saying, oh, we'll just all call each other on our cell phones. If one student didn't have a cell phone, then that wouldn't be an effective option for them. So once students brainstormed or disclosed what technology was available to them, I asked them to brainstorm all the ways they might communicate. I wanted them to think about multiple solutions to an issue. I wanted them to think about all of the different ways that were available. And this was another way where I wanted people to be invited in and to ensure that all voices and all perspectives had a place to go. Once students had brainstormed all the ways they might communicate, Then they developed a primary communication plan, a backup, and 2 backup communication plans to ensure that all group members had the information they needed to connect with all 3 backup plans. I do think that all students decided on using their phones or texting as their if all else fails plan. So moving on to the group rubric, after each group activity, I ask students to reflect on the following criteria in the group performance part of the rubric. We were all able to connect. The conversation facilitator kept us on track and redirected us when we needed it. The note taker did a great job of capturing our conversation and checking with us to be sure the details were correct. The inclusion officer made sure everyone was heard, and if there was a majority opinion for a decision, the inclusion officer advocated for that decision, or that opinion during group decisions. We came together as a team, we managed our time well, we stayed in German, we stayed on topic. As you can probably tell, I articulated my expectations for how their group would function in these rubric criteria. So rather than stating my expectations explicitly in class, I found that allowing students to see them on the rubric and rating their team on these aspects each session actually resulted in more buy-in from the students. So we had already set our group agreements, they had already set their team agreements, and I didn't really find it necessary to discuss these individual items in class, and thought that the group of students that I was working with in the spring would really respond well to that. So then when thinking about their own performance in the group work rubric, I asked students to reflect only on their preparation, their engagement, and their contribution to team dynamics. And so there were far fewer individual criteria because I really wanted students to focus on coming together as a team and supporting each other in their learning, particularly with everything that was going on last spring. And then this last question on the rubric, is there anything else you think I should know about how things went today? This question itself is the reason the rubric existed at all. I wanted to normalize conversation with students about how things were going in their groups so that were there any problems, we would already have an established method of communication to use to talk about it. Students wouldn't need to go out of their way to let me know if there was a problem or something that needed to be addressed. And this full handout, again, is in the Google Drive. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about maintaining ongoing student engagement. Students really want to know that their instructor cares about them and wants them to do well. And I found the best way to maintain student engagement, aside of course from engaging content and varied assessment strategies, was just to be flexible. So I personally am a super planner. So that means before the first day of the semester, I have my lesson plans done for the entire 15 weeks, the schedule, the readings, the assignments, they're all posted online. This structure actually helps me to be flexible when I'm teaching because I can adapt to the needs of the class and still know that we're going to get to the end of the content by the end of the semester. So being flexible with deadlines, due dates, assessment modifications, and the like demonstrated to students that I was listening and I really did care. And this in turn led to higher engagement. So I personally use one question to help me determine whether something can change or not. And that question is, how important is it that? So for example, how important is it that this transcript is turned in by midnight Friday? Well, I'm not going to grade it until Monday morning at the earliest, so it is not at all important. I can be flexible with the due date. How important is it that all students turn in a final project? The final project is how students demonstrate their learning for the entire semester, and it is where learning outcomes are assessed. It's therefore very important that every student turns in a final project. So the more flexibility that I can show my students, the more committed that they are to the class and the more engaged they are. Humans tend to spend time where they feel welcome and appreciated, and flexibility is one way we can show students that we care. Facilitating large group discussions, I'm just going to say that this is difficult. Hopefully students have done some preparation before class or are reporting out from their small group discussions. However, this isn't always feasible. And what I found was early on, I would ask a question and rely on the raise your hand function or the chat function for students to engage, but they really didn't engage in discussion that way. There would be long, awkward silence, and please keep in mind that I'm a language teacher, and so I'm used to especially long silences while my students are trying to figure something out in the target language. So I'm talking about really long, awkward silences. I found with my group of students that typing on the whiteboard and then offering another annotation activity like circle the comment you most want to discuss helped get students ready to share verbally, and it allowed for engagement from students who weren't able to connect their microphone or students who were hesitant to speak in class. The poll option is another tool that I used to get the discussion going. So offering a question, a few possible responses, and one response that was always something else, and then waiting for students to participate, and then showing responses to the students gave us something easier to discuss first. So what do you notice about the poll? Does someone who said X care to elaborate? Does anyone else have anything to add? How about someone who said Y? And then toward the end of spring, when I coupled the poll with the whiteboard, this allowed students to share anonymously perspectives that they might have been hesitant to share otherwise. And I know language teachers out there, some of the topics that our students discuss can be really personal. And so sometimes that anonymity is really empowering. So one thing that I noticed about small group discussions is no matter how clear the instructions and clear the roles, my students usually started every small group discussion with the question, so what are we supposed to do? And this confused me at first because I thought I had just given clear instructions and there was a worksheet with those instructions for them to fill out. But upon further reflection, this question, I think, isn't really about clarifying the instructions, but about forming the group for the activity. So what are we supposed to do? Question allows the students to start to talk and connect without actually starting the work. And that group formation piece, I think, is really important. It's where they come together, set their working norms for their small group in the activity. And so I decided to build in an extra 3 minutes for the so what are we supposed to do question, because I think it really was about group cohesion and pulling everyone together as a group. So in terms of the language classroom, for me, that meant that I very rarely sent students into groups of more than 2 students with the instruction to talk for 5 minutes about their favorite hobbies or something similar. I reserved small group work for 10 to 15-minute projects or conversations, or longer, so that they would have time to form the group before diving into the project. And then for shorter practice activities, like what do you like to do in your free time or other conversational pieces like that, I would just call on people in the main room. So I do have a handout for small group discussions. And it's my hope that this will help you plan a meaningful discussion activity and ensure that students have the tools they need to be successful. I do recommend having groups work in Google Docs that you set up as the instructor. As I said before, you can monitor group progress in the Google Docs and then jump in to check on groups that don't seem to be making good progress. You will find an example group notes handout in German with translations added in English. And this handout, minus the English, is representative of the documents I assigned for completion during group work. It starts with the goal of the project, functional information, or factual information from the preparatory materials for discussion, and then brainstorming questions about the activity itself. I also include at the end what I call a back pocket activity. This is a bonus activity that students can engage in while waiting for other groups to complete the brainstorming activity. And as you can tell when you go through that document, the creation of the story itself happened on a different class day. All right, and I just wanted to share a note about remote assessment. As a language teacher, I am a firm believer in multiple low-stakes assessments. I think these assessments allow students to show their learning without dealing with the pressure of high-stakes exams. And since assessments are ongoing throughout the semester, I think they offer a more exact picture of student learning throughout the term. In a remote delivery space, multiple low-stakes assessments help students demonstrate their learning regardless of the multitude of technological challenges they may be experiencing. A variety of assessment forms accommodate students who might have technological challenges with one form or another and add variety to the course, which helps maintain student interest and engagement. When quizzes and exams are used, I found that offering a time window, for example, Wednesday at noon through Friday at 8 a.m., helped students schedule their exam when their home testing environment was the most conducive to careful thought, and it also gives students with broadband issues the opportunity to take their exam when their signal strength is highest, or go to a location with good quality Wi-Fi. Assessment designs such as time limits and randomized questions can keep an exam relatively secure without a remote proctoring tool. And finally, I am not a private investigator, and so I am a proponent for assessments that are intentionally designed so that only the student themselves could complete it. So instead of a term paper on a general topic, I like students to complete recorded reports about some aspect of the content that they are personally interested in or connected to. This assessment design makes it extremely difficult for students to plagiarize or to engage in academic misconduct.